Okay, so in doing this video, I'm hoping two things. One, that you can't hear the neighbor's dogs barking, and two, that you like weird books, because this is a weird book, and I'm gonna talk about it. So, welcome back to Tiff Reads Books, where I read books and then I talk to you about them. Organ Meats by K-Ming Chan is surrealist horror with a feminine perspective. This book is really hard to talk about because of the way that it's written. Organ Meats follows two girls who tie themselves to each other figuratively and literally through a red thread. So they each have a red thread that they tie around, that one of the girls ties around both of their necks, and then she severs the thread between them. So they're basically metaphorically tied together now by the fact that they're both wearing these red threads. And they're both wearing these red threads around their neck because they're pretending that they're collars for them to be dogs. That's kind of where it starts, and then it spirals out into this big metaphor for the ties that we have to other people, and maybe the ones that aren't necessarily so healthy, or other people don't see as healthy, or other people don't desire for us, and not knowing what we want out of those friendships or relationships, but done in such a weird way. So everything in this book is written in purpley prosy, metaphorically poetic things. I stopped doing the synopsis because that's how the book goes. You get a little bit, so the girls tie themselves to each other, and then we get all of these folklore stories of women, of dogs with women's faces, or dogs who can turn into women, or women who are dogs, as a metaphor for toxic heterosexual romantic relationships where women were abused and misused and mistreated and expected to be loyal regardless. And so one of the girls' moms, Anita's a little weird, and she views things through this very odd lens. Everything is a game to her. Everything is a metaphor for something else. Every item is not what it really is. It represents something else to her. And that's how she views the world, because that's how her mom is. There's so many weird stories in here. Her mom tells her these weird stories about women who could turn into dogs and would come down the mountain in mudslides and devour the men below for daring to go up into the mountains to try to hunt the dogs. After telling her a story about women in her family who used to be dogs in a metaphorical sense, in that they were loyal and obedient regardless of what their master did to them. She tells this through a story of, I believe, her great-grandmother or a great aunt who knew her husband was cheating on her, and then her husband couldn't make the meeting with his mistress, so she was told to deliver a letter to the mistress explaining why he couldn't be there, and she did it, knowing that her husband was being unfaithful. And she's like, this is why women are dogs, used to be dogs. My mother, so this is all written in a conversation. So there's different formats for different chapters in this book as well, and different voices, and I'll get to that. My mother said, I wish she had just been a dog and talked to him. Better to be a dog. The problem is we've never had any dogs in our family. Never. That's why no one keeps a man in this family. Men want a dog. They want someone who will need them, who will never refuse them. Dogs will take anything you give them. Me. So are you a dog? My mother. No, we are women. Before that, we were women wearing the flesh of dogs. There's a distinction between that and a dog. Our mothers and mothers' mothers were true dogs, though they wore human flesh. So much of the book is written like this. And so Anita hears that from her mother, and because she is young and imaginative, she takes that as literally they were dogs. So she's like, oh, I'm descended from dogs. So she goes to Rainey, her neighbor, and she's like, let's play dogs. Let's be dogs. And there's so much of the story that is the two of them pretending to be dogs and just witnessing things in the world around them. And with that, they're playing under this large sycamore tree in their city, and they're viewing it as, at one point, Rainey ends up staring at it for a while, and Anita tells her that it's a goddess. It's a skeleton of a goddess and all of these things. And then on the other side of this tree, there's a chain link fence that goes into an empty lot where the neighborhood feral dogs live, and they're dangerous, but also not. And Anita thinks that they are gods in dogs' bodies and that they're speaking to her and they're telling her things about the world. She keeps thinking that she's hearing them from dogs. We get chapters from the dog's perspective in the Greek chorus. And that's where you have like a group, like a collective saying, we saw this and we did this. It's where the, like, if you think, when I learned about what the Greek chorus was, I was like, oh, I've seen that a bunch of times, but I always put it into Disney's Hercules, where you have the muses break in and break the fourth wall and start singing to you about what's happening. That's the Greek chorus. And so there's this one where the chapter is called The Neighborhood Bitches. Bitches, both figurative and literal, narrate what is troubling them, and bunk beds are ripe for intimacy and trickery. That's the name of the chapter. We are the bitches under the sycamore tree. Don't mistake us for strays, those dogs who don't have names, though that is how we appear in the day. We have names. At night, we lug around our human heads, carrying them low to the ground, searching for puddles to peer into like mirrors, so that we may be reminded we were once women, born from dogs. We straddle several species, and we can speak as many. And then we just have, like, the dogs going on this whole story about the neighborhood. 140 pages, the plot starts. So this is only 265 page book, and the first 140 pages is a lot of like thoughts on relationships and intimacy and control and society and what it means to fit into society and to be acceptable, because we have Rainey, who doesn't view these things as fantastical on her own. Anita guides her. Rainey is a little more logical and serious about things, and Anita is much more head in the clouds type of character. So about halfway through the book, Rainey and her family move away, and Anita becomes determined to seek contact with Rainey, but Rainey has cut the red thread from her neck. So Anita learns to go dream walking and tries to find Rainey in her dreams. And when this happens, Anita gets stuck in a 10-year-long sleep until Rainey comes to find her, because she meets a woman who is a dendrologist, a tree doctor. And this woman is actually probably one of the dogs. And then she convinces her to go back to her hometown. There's so many loud ass cars outside. I hate this street. Convinces her to go back to her hometown by giving her a branch of the sycamore tree. But this branch starts to rot and smell like rotting flesh. So Rainey needs to bring it home to reattach it to the tree, and that's when she finds out that Anita is essentially dying in this sleep. And what she ends up having to do is rebuild Anita a new body for her spirit to come back into. And she does this by collecting random items that resemble organs. And it's so weird because essentially, if I am understanding correctly, Rainey was drawn back to her childhood home because of the stresses in her life. Because when she meets the tree doctor, she has just lost her job, and it was a job she didn't like anyway, because she found herself not fitting in and not enjoying the type of environment that was required of her. She was starting to question who she is and how she wants to interact with the world, because she's 19 or 20, somewhere around there. And her mom has a lot of opinions on who she should be, and she doesn't quite think the same way as her mom, or that she might want that. So she ends up being drawn back home, where she felt comforted because Anita could always figure out what things meant. And Anita always knew what to do, and Anita could always come up with something. So when she sees that Anita now needs her help, it kind of sparks this thing in her to start looking at the world in a very different way and embracing her like inner weirdness. Yes, so Rainey is starting to reach a point where she is looking at the world through a different lens and seeing things in a very different way, instead of just seeing them as they are, and kind of embracing the lack of acceptance of the rules of the world that Anita's family has. Her whole family is very different. They have their own sense of spirituality. It says on the back, like, it's about intimacy and the horrors of intimacy. And I think in addition to that, it's about the horrors of being in a relationship and having no control over that relationship. And that's where we talk about the women being dogs. And then we also get a lot of interactions between Rainey and Anita when they were children, as Anita having entire control over the relationship. So there was kind of this sense of like almost relief for Rainey for leaving, because Anita was so demanding of her time and wanted to spend every moment she could with her and be around her constantly. And then when she left, Rainey didn't even think about her for years until she felt she was missing something in her life and felt called back. And because of the way the book ends, we don't really get any examination of how their friendship or relationship moves going forward, because Anita is very much in love with Rainey in the book. We don't really know how Rainey feels about that. But from a 9 or 10-year-old's perspective, Anita is incredibly in love with Rainey. And so we don't really know like the full extent of that because of the way the book ends. There's so much in here that, because it's written so metaphorically and so poetically, could be really interpreted in so many different ways. But what I think this is, and the reason that I liked it as much as I did, is this is another little girls are feral story. And we get so many portrayals in media, and I think it's starting to shift finally, of little girls being very demure and quiet and all of these things. And then we get stories like What Lies in the Woods that I really enjoyed, where it's these little girls that go out and play goddess in the woods, and they are like violent and aggressive and like pretending to be witches and goddesses and all of these things. Kind of the embracing of that. And this has a lot of that, like, little girls are weird, and much more weird than like as a society we give them credit for. And then it's two girls just kind of embracing that. There's not a lot of parental supervision of them, and some of that comes from the fact that they're in a very impoverished area. And that tends to happen when you have single mothers in impoverished areas. You don't have a lot of adult supervision. It reminded me a lot of growing up in the 90s, where as soon as I was like 11, I was in charge of my younger siblings, my 3 younger siblings, for multiple hours of the day until my mom got home. And I had 2 parents. They both had to work. So the 90s were a very different time, and we did a lot of like just being outside in the neighborhood playing with the other kids, and we did not have a lot of adult supervision. This kind of hits on a lot of that, on a lot of the weird games we would play and things like that. This is much more gross than I remember being, but I don't think it's a stretch, considering that I know that there were kids that were this gross when I was this young. I just chose not to be with them because it grossed me out. And some of these things in this book did gross me out. There's a lot of talk of bodily fluids, and I don't do well with bodily fluids. Like, there's a lot of piss and shit in this book, and I don't enjoy that. But it was easy enough to like skip over, or just a line or two, but there's a lot of lines or two, like they're spread out, but there's not a lot of detail. It's just like, apart from 1 or 2 scenes. Which, let's go ahead and get into the trigger warnings in this chaotic ass video of me trying to explain this book. So content warnings is, like I said, bodily fluids. There's no vomit, which is nice. There are things with teeth and mouths, like a lot of things with teeth and mouths, and I don't like mouths or teeth. Like the same thing that people have with eyeballs, I have that with mouths and teeth. So those grossed me out. There was a part where I was like, oh my god, I need to stop reading this, and I just like kind of skimmed to get past it. So yeah, there's some of that. There's a lot of like talks of like sweat and like licking people's sweat off their bodies, which I also found kind of gross. So those are kind of the gross things. There's a lot of talk about entrails and organs. Obviously the book is called Organ Meats. So there's a lot of like talk about like innards and things like that. There's a lot of blood. There is a lot of descriptions of injuries. There's some minor sexual stuff, but it's incredibly minor and not very detailed. And then animal cruelty. So there is a scene in here where Rainey, in order to get an organ does severely injure a dog, but the dog grows everything back immediately and runs away happier than it was before. So, but there's a lot of animal neglect because of the stray dogs that are through this whole book, and a lot of them have some pretty severe injuries from other children in the neighborhood. So there's a lot of discussion of injured animals in here. And then there's discussions of there's child abandonment, there's child neglect, there is bugs and mushrooms and lots of gross things. Like, if I were to list everything that people are grossed out by, I would probably have a 30-minute video just listing all the things. There's no sexual assault in here, which is nice. There is no sexual violence, which is also nice. There is, so those are the things that aren't in here. But there's lots of biting. And then, yeah, I think those are the most things in here. There really isn't a lot of like, there's a lot of one or two things. Like there's, like I said, a lot of body fluids, a lot of entrails, and a lot of blood and a lot of injury description. But there's not a lot of violence in this book. I don't think there's any violence. It's all just, it's horror because it's disgusting. I honestly don't know what I would classify this book as, but I am intrigued to read more from this author. She does have two other books called The Gods of Want and Bestiary, and she does say in her acknowledgments that this is essentially part of what feels like a mythic triptych. So she said, I feel so lucky and so grateful to have completed what feels like a mythic triptych. Bestiary, Gods of Want, and now Organ Meats complete the cycle. This trio feels like one body of text, and to see all three of them side by side will truly feel like a beautiful rebirth. So I'm curious to read the other ones. I honestly can't, I still don't know. I finished this last night at like 2 a.m. and I still don't know. A 3.5, a 4, or 4. I don't know how I feel about this still, which is unusual for me. Normally I know within like an hour or two, or like if I'm so tired, I just go to bed and I sleep on it and I know what I feel about it in the morning. I don't know what I feel about this because there was so much in it that grossed me out, but I feel like that was purposeful. And the writing was there were so many beautiful phrases in here, and the metaphors were like, it took me so long to read this because you need to read every line. You don't know where the sentence is going to end based on where it starts, because it is just so surreal. Nothing in here is real, but nothing in here is tangible, but it's all real. Like, bro, if anyone else has read this and knows how to describe this, please tell me, because I don't. I don't know how to describe it, but I loved every second of it. So, anyway, as I was doing before, this one doesn't have a cover artist, it has a cover designer, because this is all graphically designed, and the cover designer is Michael Morris, and the images were from a private collection where they're listed on the back of the book, so they're all graphically designed. Yes, Organ Meats. Please tell me what you think about it if you've read it. If this encouraged you to read it at all, please let me know, because I did not do this justice and I'm so confused. I feel like I'm more confused after trying to talk about it. So I'm gonna go back to work.